While growing up, my family were good friends with the McNeilsons that lived down the street from us. We knew them from church and they had children with similar ages as my family, which made interacting quite easy. The McNeilsons were a very loving family to us, and on the more wealthy side of the middle class. Our families would oftentimes spend summer vacations together, whether that was camping or staying at the McNeilsons' lake house just across town. My friend Tommy McNeilson, who oddly enough shared my same birthday as me, although different years, were basically inseparable in our younger years. Tommy and I always joked that his father was a spy or worked for the government since his dad was always on the phone, and we didn't know exactly what he did for work. He seemed to have an odd amount of wealth for not having a specific job title, but that didn't really matter to me. Tommy and I were on the same baseball team growing up, and we'd spend every weekend at each other's houses. Basically, I was a part of their family, and he was a part of mine. We both went to different colleges, but we still kept in touch and were great friends. 2 years before graduating, Tommy would get in an accident on his motorcycle and would unfortunately pass away. Both of our families were devastated, and this unfortunate circumstance had caused our families to become even closer. I would go on to eventually graduate college and take an internship at a financing firm across town. Surprisingly enough, very close to the McNeilsons' lake house. I called Mrs. McNeilson and asked if it would be okay if I were to stay at the lake house during the summer for a few weeks. "Of course," she said excitedly over the phone. She was absolutely delighted at the idea and even offered to stock the lake house with food for me. "I know that your mother would have done the same for Tommy," she said. I had to decline the food part since it felt a bit unfair, but I appreciated the offer. She did warn me, however, that there had been some issues at the lake house more recently. It wasn't up to date as well, she said. "But I mean, if you don't mind that, then it's all yours," she said. I didn't really know what she meant by any of that, so I just put it in the back of my mind, and I moved forward with my internship. I pulled up to the lake house with my loaded up Toyota and I parked in the gravel driveway. The lake house seemed to be just as I remembered it since high school. I even was able to find the fake stone that hid the spare key that I soon then put on my keychain for the time being. I unlocked the door and went inside. Right away when I turned on the lights, I noticed that the lake house was not kept up at all. All the furniture was piled on a very specific spot on the rug on the floor. I then remembered, having stayed there for many summers, that the lake house had a crawlspace that you could access from the living room hatch that was on the floor that led outside. That's where all the furniture was. I thought. It's kind of weird. The thing is that you have to remember is that the McNeilsons had a lot of family. I figured that one of their children used the lake house for whatever reason and just didn't clean up. Oh well. The lake house had 2 stories and had a large window facing the lake. The lake was rather large, although I don't ever remember there being any other lake houses being there. At the lake there was a small boathouse that covered the McNeilsons' boat. I wouldn't ever need to use the boat nor even check the boathouse for that reason. I rearranged the furniture to look somewhat normal and began to bring in my stuff. I didn't have much other than my clothes and didn't even think to get groceries. That would be something I'd have to get the next day. Nighttime eventually came and I was without internet, but I did have data I could use on my phone. I did a quick walk around to the lake house to make sure that everything was fine and that all the doors were locked up. I did have an incident growing up where someone broke into my house while my family and I were still there. I'd never see the person that did it, but I saw what was left of my family's home the next morning. Our living room was destroyed and the back door to our house was left wide open. We lived in a very safe suburban area, so this event stayed with me for quite some time. Even to this day, I still think about it every night right before I go to sleep. After a quick walk around of the place I was staying, I had seen that everything appeared to be locked up. However, I did notice at the bottom of the hill in the backyard, the boathouse light was on. It was around 11 or so at night, and I figured that I didn't notice it during the day since it was still bright out. The idea still scared me that someone was using the boathouse, and I considered calling the police. But seeing how this was something that didn't warrant immediate police action, I figured I could just go down there and turn off the lights myself. I briefly searched the house I was staying in for any type of weapon and found Mr. McNeilson's golf clubs.
I grabbed a 7-iron and made my way down there. The walk wasn't long, and I could see before I got there that there were indeed people inside. I stepped off the path, hid in the trees, and called the police right then and there. The police came in roughly 30 minutes, and I made sure to be at the house so I could guide them where the intruders were. The police followed me down there, and sure enough, there were 5 people or so, dressed in black robes. The police entered the boathouse with their weapons drawn and arrested everyone inside. After it was safe, I was allowed to go inside to check to see if there was any damage done to the boat or anything. Inside appeared to be different cult drawings on the floor with a few dozen candles lit. The boathouse wasn't new or anything, but it had seen better days. Despite the drawings and the candles, nothing seemed to be out of place. The police asked if I wanted to press charges, and I relayed that to the McNeilsons. That was their call. After that eventful evening, I didn't feel safe at the lake house, yet I had no real reason to leave. The problem had been removed, and I was essentially safe. However, I did begin to feel more and more uneasy. Every night after, I would make sure to do a walk around of the house and make sure that everything was locked up. I would also make sure that the boathouse light would stay off. One evening, I woke up in the middle of the night to get some food in the kitchen area. All the lights were off inside, but a single glimmer came from the backyard and caught my eye. The boathouse light was on again. Before I could call the police, the light turned off as if nothing had happened. Perhaps I imagined it. I found this to be strange, and I waited by the window for 10 minutes to see if the light would turn on again, but it never did. I couldn't see at this distance if anyone came in or out of the boathouse, but I couldn't see anything. The next morning, I didn't have to go back into work until the afternoon, so I did a quick inspection. The boathouse door was still locked, and that was enough for me. A couple of days later, when I got home from work, I pulled into the gravel driveway when the sun started to set, not too far into the distance. I walked into the house like I always did, and for whatever reason, I felt the urge to look out the rear window. The light to the boathouse wasn't on, but I saw something more strange near the dock and the water. The daylight was enough for me to see what looked like an outline of a person standing waist deep in the water. I couldn't see any features, but it strongly resembled a person just standing there. I was more confused at this point than afraid. I went into the backyard and I went down to see what was going on. However, as I went out to see who was standing by the dock, the figure slowly waded out into the lake, keeping the same distance between us. When the water was too deep for the figure, it submerged its head beneath the water. I stood on the dock waiting for them to re-emerge, but they never came up for air. Maybe they were just a good swimmer, I thought. Maybe it wasn't even a person, it was just maybe like a stray log or something. I didn't want my only explanation to be that it was some kind of ghost in the water. This did give me shivers down my spine as I walked back to the main house. I turned around hoping that I would see something come out of the water, but nothing ever did. That night as I locked up the house, I decided specifically not to look out the window towards the boathouse. I didn't want to risk seeing something standing on the dock in the eerie moonlight. Thank goodness nothing happened that night. The next day the same thing happened when I got home, except instead of the shadowy figure standing in the water, it was standing on the dock. It wasn't much closer, but I could see the figure had long dark hair covering its face. This time I didn't hesitate, and I ran out there with the same 7-iron to confront the supposed woman on the dock, but as I got closer to the figure, it went into the water about shoulder deep and stayed at that height as they drifted off into the lake. The figure didn't submerge this time, and I could see a pale face with green eyes looking at me as they went further and further into the lake. Okay, this was it for me. I'm out of here. I decided that I was going to move out the next day, and that I was going to find something else in town. I just needed to get through the night. Night slowly came, and I felt an odd energy in the air. I locked up extra early in hopes to fall asleep and not have to deal with what was going on in the backyard. Curiosity got the better of me, and I briefly looked out the window to see if that figure had returned. It was so dark I couldn't see anything in the trees, but at least I could tell that no one was on the dock. I felt a sense of relief, but it didn't last long. A couple of hours later, as I laid in bed trying to sleep, I heard a sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like a slapping sound on glass. I went downstairs and I didn't see anything outside. I did see, though, on the back patio were wet footprints that went around the house. I began to panic as I knew that something was trying to get in. I then heard a sound that caused me to jump out of my skin. I heard something underneath the wooden floor shuffling. I then remembered about the crawlspace hatch in the living room. Right when I realized what was happening, the crawlspace hatch began to open, slowly. The only thing I could think to do was to jump on it with my body weight. I jumped on the hatch door and slammed it shut while I heard screaming coming from underneath the floors. A surprising amount of force then jolted me up as something began pounding on the hatch. I knew that my weight wouldn't be enough to keep the hatch shut, so I did what I thought was best and began stacking furniture on the hatch door. After moving a couple of chairs and a couch onto the hatch, the pounding eventually stopped. I didn't hear any more shuffling and I left right then and there. I told the McNeilsons what had happened the next morning, and they told me that this wasn't the first time that this had happened. This was actually why they stopped coming in the first place. They think it had something to do with the cult activity or even the young woman that died on the lake 10 years ago, but they weren't sure. They apologized to me saying that they were hoping that the activity had gone away, but from my experience, it most certainly did not.
Who doesn't love a good ghost story, especially around the holidays? I reviewed countless accounts of the paranormal and supernatural in online articles and TV shows. I speak from experience when I say until it happens to you, you will have a hard time believing any of these stories. I openly admit that some are more plausible than others, and most of the ones you hear about nowadays are just made-up garbage. With that being said, I will ask the listener to please keep an open mind. My goal in submitting my story is not to convince anyone of the existence of the paranormal, but to simply share my experience with the world. Perhaps someone in the audience has gone through something similar and could have some type of reassurance that they're not alone, and that there are some things out there that science cannot always explain. But I must warn you, things are going to get pretty deep. Back in law school, my professor would often say, "Sometimes it's hard to remain objective in a subjective reality." I couldn't agree more. I come from a wealthy family. My grandfather was the co-founder of one of the biggest pharmaceutical corporations in Canada, and eventually became the CEO when my grandfather became too old to run the company. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this all played a pretty significant role in me pursuing my law degree. I love my family, but I am not blind to the unfair practices that pharmaceutical corporations get up to, and my family's company is no exception. That's partly why I decided to become a labor attorney. I wanted to protect the little guy from being screwed over by big corporations. I would like to think that I make a difference, but I'm not going to lie. The good guys do not always win. This story isn't about that, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm preaching. I just wanted you guys to know a little bit about me. Let's turn back the clock to the winter of 1985. It was late December, right around Christmas time. Now, I mentioned earlier that my grandfather founded his company in Canada. However, my father was born in New England, and that's where me and my sister grew up. Every year, my father and grandfather would go on extended hunting trips in upstate New York. My grandparents owned an old manor there, and we would spend most of our Christmases there. The manor was enormous. It was 3 stories tall, had a fountain out front, and of course was surrounded on all sides by a thick forest. I can't recall all the history of the manor, but I do know that it was originally built as a hospital in colonial times, and that many people had died there because of the lack of understanding when it came to certain illnesses in those times. As you can imagine, this place had its share of ghost stories, but me and my sister didn't really invest much into such things. We were more interested in playing hide-and-go-seek or tag in the long, endless corridors. The mansion had a very large basement. My grandparents would store a lot of antiques and furniture that they had collected over the years down there. We were never allowed in there because my parents were worried that we would end up hurting ourselves or breaking something extremely valuable. So naturally, being the curious troublemakers we were, whenever me and my sister were left alone in the old house, we would always try and see if the door that led down into the basement was left unlocked. Much to our dismay, it was always locked, but this did not deter us. In fact, we sort of turned it into a game, roaming through the old house looking for a magic key that would open the basement door. However, in the winter of 1985, everything would change. My father and grandfather were off on their traditional hunting trip, and my mother and grandmother were doing some Christmas shopping in town. At this time, I was 15, and my sister Natalia was 12, so we were old enough to be on our own for a little while. We no longer played our little games around the manor, but we both were still very curious about what was in the basement. So as soon as we were left alone, we quickly made our way to the basement door. We expected it to be locked, as it had been so many times before. But with a turn of the old metal handle, the door swung open with a creak. I flipped the switch on the wall to my right, and a single light bulb flickered to life above my head, revealing a set of old wooden stairs that led down into the dark basement. I turned back to my sister, and she seemed to be just as astonished as I was. After so many years, we would finally get to see what was down in the basement. We made our way down the staircase and stumbled around in the darkness. The initial creepiness was replaced by aggravation, as we could not locate another light switch that would illuminate the rest of the basement. Natalia rushed back up the stairs and grabbed a pair of flashlights from our suitcases. She returned a short time later, and soon, our flashlight beams revealed a maze of sheets covering various unknown objects. If I were to give you an accurate description of what was in the basement, think of the movie The Others, where Nicole Kidman's character encountered the old blind woman in the junk room. Remember how those white sheets were covering all the furniture? Imagine that on a larger scale. Me and Natalia made our way through the sea of obstacles, occasionally uncovering the ones that looked like they had an interesting shape to them. They were mostly old-fashioned tables, chairs, and shelves, stuff that we were just too young to truly appreciate. When we got to the very back of the basement, there was a corridor that went back for about 30 feet, and then suddenly stopped. It was an odd design. It looked like a hallway that was walled off halfway through. There was something mounted to the very end of this corridor that was covered by a white, dirty bed sheet. Curious, we both approached the unknown object. I instantly noticed that there was a light fixture on the ceiling, along with a switch on the wall to my left. I flipped the switch and the corridor was illuminated. We both then turned our attention to the dirty sheet that was ominously covering whatever was mounted to the wall in front of us. There wasn't much discussion between us. It was mutually decided that we were going to find out what was underneath. We both pulled on either side of the sheet to discover an old wall-mounted mirror. Since we were on either side of the mirror when we pulled the sheet off, we didn't see our reflections right away. The mirror had one of those worn-down carved frames, and its glass was badly stained and cracked. It wouldn't have looked out of place in a dumpster. But as we would soon find out, this was no ordinary mirror. Natalia bent down to tie her shoe as I stood in front of the mirror. At first, it was difficult to make out my reflection, but I was startled to discover an old man staring back at me. I dropped my flashlight out of fear and fell backward. My sister looked up and saw the frightened look on my face, and then asked me what was wrong. I saw an old man in the mirror. I swear to God. She gave me a confused look before quickly standing up and facing the mirror herself. She instantly went still, and then began to visibly tremble. I got to my feet and looked into the mirror. Aside from the horrified look on my sister's face, Both of our reflections were normal. However, something was seriously freaking my sister out. I placed my hand on her shoulder and was about to ask her if she was okay, but before I could get a word out, I was cut off by a shriek of terror. My sister screamed so loud, I'm surprised she didn't shatter the old mirror. She took off back into the basement and up the stairs. I took one last look at my blurry reflection before turning off the light and following my sister back up the stairs. Natalia was inconsolable after that. She spent the rest of that night crying in bed. From that day forward, she wasn't the same person. She became cold and distant, and this lasted for years. As she got older, she became bitter towards everyone, and even had these night terrors where she would wake up screaming, always standing in front of her dresser mirror. I knew that whatever she saw in that old mirror at my grandparents' manor was the root cause of all of this. What I saw in my reflection was certainly frightening, but I eventually put it behind me. Whatever she saw must have been much worse, to the point where it mentally scarred her. I tried talking to her about it several times, but she would instantly shut me down, even threatened to kill me in my sleep on one occasion. I brought up what happened in the basement to my parents, but all they did was scold me for going down there. Natalia's strange behavior didn't go unnoticed by my parents. It wasn't long before she was attending therapy, and shortly after, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The night terrors became worse, and she even started sleepwalking. She would go to all the different mirrors in our house and just stare into them for hours before screaming. From a young age, Natalia had a gift for drawing pictures. Before that day in the manor, she would draw typical pictures of our family holding hands. However, after that day in the basement, she would draw these pictures of a mangled-looking woman who had half of her face missing. Natalia's mental health would continue to deteriorate, and as it did, she was put on a cocktail of different medications. The drugs stopped the screaming, but Natalia became a shell of her former self, reduced to just sitting and staring blankly off into space. This tore my family apart. My parents could never agree on how to go about treating Natalia. My father wanted to have her committed, but my mother was adamantly against it. This caused them to fight a lot, and they would eventually divorce many years later. Shortly after graduating from high school, I moved out of my parents' house. My dad rented out an apartment for me while I attended college, and I was grateful for that. As difficult as it is for me to admit, I did not want to be around Natalia anymore. I no longer wanted to watch my mother desperately try to get through to her, trying to bring back the sweet girl she once was. Some time passed, and one day I received a phone call from my dad. I could tell by the sound of his voice that he did not have good news. He eventually told me that my sister had wandered away from the house the night before and made her way to a nearby highway. The next part is difficult for me to relay, and I will not go into details, but according to the police, several eyewitnesses saw Natalia throw herself in front of a speeding semi-truck. About a week later, I watched my sister's closed casket being lowered into the ground. I kept thinking about that old mirror in the basement of my grandparents' manor. With my sister's diagnosis and the passing of time, I had almost forgotten all about that day, and I began to wonder, what did she see in its reflection that day? That question wouldn't be answered until many years later. In 2017, my mother passed away. Me and my wife spent a couple of days gathering all of her belongings from her house before we put it on the market. In my mother's attic, I came across a box marked Natalia. The box contained some of my sister's old clothes and other small things. At the very bottom of the box, I found a large folder. In this folder were some of Natalia's old drawings. I flipped through the pictures, Most of them were drawings of our happy family holding hands with big smiles on our faces. All except for one. When I got to the very last drawing in the folder, tears began to roll down my face as I held up the picture. The question that has haunted me for so many years was finally answered. The drawing was of a little girl staring into an old mirror, and the mirror's reflection was a mangled woman with half a face.